Hello. Before I say anything else, shame makes me want to say, those of you who can see the garish collision of colors that constitutes my attire this morning, take this as a sobering admonition against dressing in the dark. And also, forgive me if I get a little long-winded here. I decided, I could, taking the very broad parameters of this question and all the interesting discussions it foreshadows, I could talk about, say, modern continental philosophers who, one way or another, influence or provoke me, Badiou, Agamben. But I decided instead just to complain peevishly for about 20 minutes. And the reason is I want to sound a cautionary note in the kind of language that we allow ourselves regarding what we mean by postmodernity. I should say that, remember Gandhi's famous remark when asked about Western civilizations, he said it would be a good idea. And I feel that way about postmodern theology. It might be a good idea if it really were a recovery of a properly divine understanding of God from precisely the metaphysics of modernity, the God of the causa sui of Descartes, or the founded and founding God of ontotheology, if we take Heidegger's at least negative critical language seriously, and the theologies of the 16th through the 19th centuries that lingered into the 20th. But let me confess my suspicion of suspicion. The term postmodern theology can be as nebulous as the term, postmodern. So let me start from the premise that modernity, understood at least as a kind of ideological project, as much as a cultural history, is a particular discourse regarding the historical fatedness of a certain understanding of civil identity and personal freedom, the story of liberation, of the ascent of the individual out of the shadows of hierarchy and subsidiary identity into the light of full recognition, dignity, and autonomy. And it's a powerful narrative, whether we prefer it in its Kantian or Hegelian or romantic or some other acceptation, or just in the tempered form of a late democratic realism. Presumably, though, any truly postmodern philosophy is one that, having fully absorbed this great narrative, is nevertheless willing to undertake both a critical appropriation and appropriate critique of it. One that is capable of assuming an ironic distance from any naive acceptance of that narrative and so of situating it in a larger historical and critical context. If this definition be granted, then much of what has come in recent years to be and I'm going to call it the orthodox form of postmodern theology in the English-speaking world, somewhat failed or signally fails to be postmodern. At least in the Anglophone world in recent years, among those generally designated promoters of a postmodern theology, and I guess I would include Richard Carney and John Caputo as good specimens here, without trying to oversimplify their projects, the title has come to imply a kind of recognizable composite of some of the more easily assimilated themes provided by an earlier generation of continental thinkers, each of whom flourish sometime in the late 70s through the early 90s. Some Derridian post-structuralist principles embraced within a broad Leotardian claim to a suspicion of all meta-narratives, except, of course, the meta-narrative of this post-meta-narrative vantage on all meta-narratives. Wrapped in a brooding atmosphere of mystically oblique, almost masochistically disinterested Levinasian ethical seriousness, framed by a Vatimo-esque salvific narrative of divine kenosis as the redemptive exhaustion of the transcendent in the immanent, or of, in more discursive terms, every strong structure of being in the peacefulness of weak thought, the whole combination bedizened with touches of Foucaultian genealogy or Nancian stories of transcendental violence or Deleuze-Guattarian talk of original rupture or something like that. Generally, the guiding pretense is, and I'm sorry to sound, I'm getting a bit fatigued now. It's 15 years. Yes. Generally, the guiding pretense is of a theology that has shed the encumbrances of something called metaphysics and all its putative pathologies, the inherent violence of metaphysics, inherently violent essentialisms, hostility or insensibility towards alterity, and so forth. And what ideally should emerge from this confluence is a special piety or ethos, tolerant of difference, peaceful and patient, and unambitious and charitable. And one of its names can justly be secularity. Now I have to, as may be obvious from the deadpan with which I delivered that, I guess, there's something less than tepid sympathy on my part for this discourse. To my mind, to begin with, the project of constructing a post-metaphysical theology is somewhat preposterous. I mean, I think of it as like post-atmospheric air. And that the notion that there's such a thing as an inherent violence of metaphysics rather than simply the relative violence or peacefulness of particular metaphysical regimes, I think is a little silly. But more to the point, the claim to have escaped the metaphysical seems to me only to reiterate, or maybe I should say reinscribe, the most imperious of classical metaphysical gestures, that of the transcendental vantage that has, through some sublime moral and dialectical labor of spirit, achieved a privileged perspective capable of a transcendental surveillance of all other stories than its own. To me, this is merely a repetition, albeit transcribed into a particular social and ideological key and inflected with a particular sensibility, merely the late modern story of an enlightened reason inhabiting no perspective at all and therefore entitled and enabled to dissolve all merely local narratives into provisional, mythical, tribal chatter. In his preface to The Philosophy of Right, let me explain what I mean by metaphysical gesture. Hegel rather famously remarks that the owl of Minerva takes flight only as dusk is falling, which is to say that philosophy comes only at the end of an age, far too late in the day, to tell us how the world ought to be. It can at most merely ponder what has come to pass, and so begun to pass away. An epoch yields its secrets to rational reflection grudgingly only after its profoundest possibilities have been exhausted in the actuality of history. Quote, this is Hegel, "When philosophy paints its gray on gray, a form of life has grown old and cannot be rejuvenated but only understood," unquote. Now, it's a winsomely tragic picture of philosophy, but it's not really a humble one. It may seem to reduce philosophy to an essentially reconstructive rather than creative labor, but it's also a picture that exquisitely captures philosophy's deep and perilous ambition to be recognized simply as an intellectual discipline, but as wisdom itself. For true wisdom, as we know, belongs properly to the very old. It also suggests that the greatest philosopher of all would be the one who could plausibly claim to have come most belatedly of all, to have witnessed the very last crepuscular gleam of the dying day, and to have learned, as no one else now can, how the story truly ends. The highest aim of philosophy, then, would be to achieve a kind of transcendental belatedness, an unsurpassable finality lying always further beyond all merely local or episodic philosophies. Needless to say, Hegel entertained few doubts regarding who that greatest philosopher might turn out to be. And of course, in various ways, Heidegger, in a very different, supposedly post-metaphysical and therefore truly finally final way, most vigorously took up the challenge of Hegel's attempt to devise a grand philosophical narrative that would enclose all other philosophical narratives within its inescapable dialectical logic by seeking to overcome it and enclose his final story in one yet more final. And it's this particular, very modern and especially grandiose form of metaphysical ambition I see in any philosophy that imagines it's achieved that always more final station there at the broad open mouth of the great river of historical dialectic, where all the currents of the metaphysical tradition empty out into the infinite sea of difference. And it seems to me also that to abandon any metaphysics of a real analogical relation of dependency between the transcendent and the immanent is willy-nilly to embrace a metaphysics of unmediable difference, as Deleuze correctly identifies its ontological premises. It's a metaphysics of the univocity of being and equivocity of beings. And if I might match the alarmism of post-metaphysical discourse with some post-metaphysical alarmism of my own, it seems to me that this really is not a particularly pacific approach to the pluralism and globalism of our late modern condition. For one thing, it seems to me that truly to assert the absence of a transcendental structure of being, and one that we can reason about together, and to assert then by implication the consequent absence of an analogical grammar by which to negotiate the differences and likenesses, the particularities and universalities that exist among humans and their experiences, is to make the ultimate measure of difference inevitably strife, Heraclitean eris, and here Deleuze was a better prophet than many others. Or at any rate, it leads to a transcendental condition of alienation one from another, alleviated only by accidental and fluid alliances. I think it better still to ask whether it's possible to articulate an ontology of the transcendent, and therefore inexhaustible peace that by its transcendence allows for the harmonization of innumerably many differences and endless analogical mediations and reconciliations and accords. And this is why I think that this form of postmodern theology, what I think of as the orthodox scholastic form of postmodern theology, at least in North America right now, offers little in the way of a model for dialogue with other faiths, which is a concern of mine. A transcendental surveillance of all differences under a rule of absolutely indifferent difference can provide only a very particular set of rules of engagement. Dialogue proceeds only when all parties will consent in advance to a surrender of all claims to ultimate truth. Having thus been reduced to local or tribal artifacts of cultures now surpassed by modern reason and postmodern suspicion alike, which are supposedly innocent of metaphysical ambitions, everyone can get along. This is not very promising or interesting. Yes, traditions can talk to one another more fruitfully, honestly, and interestingly if they're willing to grant that the approach to the truth, is incalculable in its variety. But still, they're not really going to achieve much if they start from the assumption that truth as such has nothing to do with what they believe in its essence. In fact, to believe that truth, in the transcendent structure of truth, to believe that truth as expressed in the finite possesses an incalculable number of aspects and inflections and forms is to believe also that there's such a thing as transcendent truth, which by its very absolution from the conditions of the finite allows for innumerable mediating forms of participation in its inexhaustible fullness. And it's to believe that the measure of that participation is one of analogical likeness in difference and difference in likeness between distinct traditions whose terminus ad quem is one and the same transcendent horizon. To my mind, what we've come to think of as postmodern theology doesn't give us a way of actual understanding across cultures. Rather, it offers a way of reducing all cultures to a late modern Western narrative of the immanent rationality of no transcendent truth. There could scarcely be a greater impediment to meaningful dialogue between religions. And I'm speaking as someone who does engage in interfaith dialogues. I like to think a fairly sophisticated level, mostly with Asian and East Asian, that is, Indian and East Asian. All I can say is that I found it wonderfully productive to engage in discussions with, say, practitioners of Vedanta or Bhakti in the unglamorously traditional form of comparative metaphysical and spiritual studies, discovering remarkable conceptual and practical similarities, enlightening conceptual and practical differences, and proceeding all the while under the assumption that both those similarities and those differences indicate a horizon of transcendent truth that is at once approachable from the vantages of our several traditions, but that in its very transcendence allows for a limitless variety of expressions, an eternal truth, the Sanatana Dharma. And curiously enough, I've never encountered anyone among my Eastern interlocutors who I believe would really have felt I was honoring his or her tradition by claiming that it is every bit as irreducibly local and arbitrary and absolutely culturally contingent and historically exhausted as my own. Rarely have I met any serious religious thinker who would be content to imagine that his or her tradition is best viewed as an exhibit in a museum. This is only to be expected. It would be naive of us to imagine that we'll have much success in talking to persons of other faiths if we insist on beginning from a set of critical commitments that are really simply the same old modern Western triumphalist narrative of history, merely transposed into a postmodern key. The always looming absurdity of the post-metaphysical vantage is that under the pretense of a tender regard for difference, it in fact converts every particularity into just another instance of the same meaninglessness. This is not hospitality to the other, it's conquest, if of an especially dissembling kind.